Julian is a recent university graduate who is working at a startup, and he came to me because he had to learn a lot about AI. And he doesn't come from a technical background, and he was finding it really hard to learn about this effectively and know how to use it. There was a lot of stuff that he needed to catch up on. There's new stuff coming up all the time, and he didn't know how to keep up. So I had a coaching call with Julian to figure out how he's approaching his learning, what his learning system looks like, and how he can improve. There were a few key takeaways from that consultation and some strategies that I recommended to Julian that I think would be helpful for a lot of you as well. So with Julian's permission, I am sharing that one-on-one consultation with you guys. All right, so Julian, start us off by giving a bit of context in terms of what you're learning about and what your main problem is.
So for some context, I recently graduated university and I'm now working at a growing startup. And one of the things that I'm focusing on top of my work is learning how to effectively use AI. And the reason this is so important to me is because I just hear buzz about AI all the time. And now AI can do this, AI can do that. And it kind of feels like if I don't learn AI fast enough, then I'm going to fall behind in not just my job, but also my overall career. And personally for me, I don't have a technical background in AI. I come from a medicine background, but I know how important AI is. And so one of my learning goals, if I was to summarize it, is I want to be able to effectively learn how to use AI when I have limited time and limited background knowledge. And so there's a couple of problems that I'm running into right now. The first one is the lack of structure. So compared to university where there's a strict curriculum telling you what to do or not, when it comes to learning at a startup, there is no guide, no one telling you what to learn at what stage. And so I just feel a bit lost at times on what exactly I should be doing to get the most high yields for my learning. The second problem that I'm facing is the idea of information overwhelm. I just feel like there's new information coming out about AI every single day. There's a new YouTube video, new LinkedIn post saying AI can, there's a new AI tool or there's a new AI agent that can do this. And it just feels like there's so much like knowledge in this field. If I don't keep up with it every single day, then I'm just going to fall behind very quickly. So that's the second problem, information overwhelm. And then in terms of the third problem I'm facing, it's like the benefit of learning. I feel like I'm trying to learn a lot about AI, but it's not translating to a lot of tangible results. I feel like sometimes I can get a good conceptual understanding of how AI operates, but then at the end of the day, I need to actually turn that into something, into my job. Like I need to actually use this AI tool to get some sort of like result or learning. Otherwise, it kind of feels like the things that I'm learning aren't actually leading to anything tangible. So that's kind of the three like main challenges that I'm facing right now.
Okay, cool. So thanks for sharing that. So from how I see things, I think we can divide these issues you've talked about into kind of two categories of problems. The first category is the fact that there's a lack of structure. And the ways, like the strategies that you'd use to overcome this are its own. Like there are different strategies that we can use to create structure, even when no one is telling you what to do. And the next category of issues is this idea of like overwhelm and the fact that you're spending a lot of effort and not necessarily being able to translate into the result. And that comes down to the process that you're using to actually try to handle that high level of information and volume. So let's think about this. The question I want to start off with is like, why do you feel overwhelmed when all this new information comes out? Because new information is coming out about every field all the time. And yes, technology stuff is coming out, especially rapidly. But if you have an existing set of expertise, then new information is much less overwhelming. So think about it this way. So let's say that you have, right, this existing network of connections, right, inside your brain. So this is a representation of all of your existing expertise and knowledge, okay? So this is existing knowledge. So if a new piece of information comes in and you feel like this new information, which is constantly appearing, you don't know how to think about it. In other words, you don't see how it's connected to anything. You don't see the patterns between them. You don't see how they're related to each other. You don't see what the impact or importance of it is. Then you're going to perceive that feeling as overwhelm. The overwhelm is your brain saying, I don't know what to do with this information. So contrast that with how if you have a high level of expertise, an expert is able to look at this new information and they don't feel overwhelmed purely because of the fact that this new information, their brain knows how to think about it. They would look at this and say, okay, this is not overwhelming because it's very obvious that this is going to impact in this kind of way. This is not very overwhelming because it's very clear that this is purely an extension onto this. And this is not very overwhelming because it's very similar to this existing set of connections that I already have. So if you think about it in terms of like pattern recognition, your existing expertise, there's so many different patterns that you'll have internalized. And right now you're saying that you come from a background which is not very technical. So your existing patterns that you're thinking about coming from a medical background, when you look at all this new information around AI, you don't have existing patterns to compare that to. There's no way that you see how it impacts and how it's relevant. So you're never going to get to a point where this stuff doesn't feel overwhelming until you build a baseline level of expertise that allows you to create those connections, right? You're basically saying, why does it feel difficult trying to become an expert at something that I have no knowledge about, right? The answer is not about your process. Actually, it's just about the fact that you don't have any knowledge. So the first step is, how do you build that base of knowledge in a way that allows you to create as many anchor points of relevance as possible? And there are different ways that you can approach this, because you could start off by getting a huge textbook on the first principles of, mathematics and statistics and modeling and Python, and start from ground zero. And you would eventually get to a point where you have so much knowledge on this that when you see a new library coming out that you can integrate with your AI agent, you think, oh, I see the implication of that because I'm drawing on this huge body of knowledge. But 90% of the stuff that you learn is actually going to be irrelevant to you because you are not going to be using that. Like, you don't need that level. So this is going to come back to the way that you're actually structuring things. It sounds like the way that you've been trying to structure things is very use case focused. Like, I have a problem I need to solve, therefore I need to learn enough about this to be able to solve that. So naturally, unless the new thing about AI that comes out is really aligned with that particular problem that you're trying to solve, you're probably not going to see how it's relevant to the wider field of AI, and then you're going to feel overwhelmed all over again. With AI especially, this is important because of the fact that when new developments come out, it can change the entire approach of how you go about solving a problem. So if you had a certain approach to solving a problem with existing tools, when something new comes out, you might not really see how that approach can change. And then you're going to get into a sunk cost fallacy where you feel like you've spent so much time trying to understand this approach that you're not open to changing that for a new approach. How much time have you spent on actually trying to understand the actual first principle fundamentals of AI and ML and the statistical modeling and probability, and kind of not necessarily going into like the deep maths and programming of it, but actually getting your head around the first principle fundamentals of the topic itself?
Yeah, so I have spent a few hours trying to get a very broad overview of the topic itself. And I actually sent you one of my mind maps if you want to bring it up.
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So to give you the context around this, I probably spent around 1 hour just going on ChatGPT, which gave me the main topics when it came to AI, which in this case, you can see machine learning, the models, the methods, the goals it uses. And then based on the like 10-ish keywords that it kind of gave me, I then used inquiry-based learning to try and find the connections between all of these. Now, I'm aware that this is very broad and there's probably a lot of detail that I'm missing here, but this was the initial first step I took. So I'm just curious in terms of the starting point here, if you have any thoughts on anything good here, anything bad here, what's kind of like your overall perspective on the overall mind map I have.
Just before I get back into my feedback for Julian's mind map, I want to clarify something here, which is why mind maps are so powerful in the first place. I have taught mind mapping to tens of thousands of people, and I've seen tens of thousands of mind maps over the years. And what I can tell you is that mind mapping is an incredibly effective learning strategy if you do it correctly. But it is a surprisingly complicated skill to do correctly. And most people that have done mind maps and they haven't found it's useful have done it incorrectly, to be frank. Now, I realize that I don't really go into Julian's mind map in technical detail in terms of really talking about how to do it correctly. So if you are wanting to get a more in-depth guide on how to do mind mapping correctly, then I do have a guide that goes through it a little bit more step by step in one of my newsletters. If you don't know, I have a free weekly newsletter that I send out. I'll leave a link in the description for you. And one of the editions of the newsletter has a step-by-step guide on correct mind mapping technique. So if you're interested in joining, again, it's completely free. I'll leave a link for you in the description. So for the level you need to go to, this is not going to be anywhere near enough. However, for starting from zero to get to the next level, this is a good first step. You've got a basic understanding of the way that machine learning has been divided. I would say that this overall structure, as you learn more and more about the topic, is just going to essentially become irrelevant because it's so broad and basic that it's going to become just part of your innate knowledge, and so your structures will become more sophisticated. But going from zero to just having the biggest possible overview about how to think about some of these major AI principles, this is going to be a good start. So when you look at, if you're saying, okay, here's what I've studied, then I would say, okay, this is a person who's going to have a good understanding about the higher level connections between here. So if new information comes out about a new entire type of training method, you will know how to think about that because you know how to think about training methods. If a new entire branch of deep learning appears, that you might understand how that could potentially be related. But anything beyond that, so basically any new information that is more detailed than just this broad level, you're not going to be able to handle because you don't have the existing connections to map this onto. So the problems that you're facing, which are with the lower level detail, match with the level of knowledge and organization that you have here. So the solution is going to be to continue this process of mapping things out for progressively deeper and deeper layers of information. Now, this comes back to the question about structuring. If you don't know what you need to learn in what order, then how do you know how to spend that time? There are a couple of different ways that you can do it, and there's pros and cons to each. On one hand, you can choose to continue going down it in terms of the problem that you're facing. So let's say that you have this particular, understanding of things, and then there's a particular problem that you want to solve. So you'd look at your existing level of knowledge, and then you look at the problem that you have, and you ask yourself, do I have enough knowledge to apply this knowledge to effectively solve this problem? And the answer is probably at this point going to be no. So then the question is, so which part specifically am I missing right now in order for me to be able to get closer to this problem? You don't need to know the answer. There's no way to know the exact knowledge that you're missing, but you can get to a point where you ask the right questions to figure out where that gap is. So you might look at the existing problem that you have and then say, the reason that I can't use this knowledge is because not just it's not specific enough, which is a very broad statement, but because you might say, I don't understand which training method will be relevant for this problem. Or you might say, I don't even understand if I need to train anything for this. Or you might look at it from a completely different perspective and say that actually I'm trying to decide which AI tool to use. I don't understand how I can use this knowledge to decide on the best AI tool. So once you've been very specific about your gap, you can then ask questions where if you were to know the answers to these, it would put you in a better position to answer that. So let's take that final example. Let's say all you're trying to do is figure out which existing AI tools do I need to use to be able to solve this problem. You might look at this and say, okay, cool. I have a general understanding about how these AI tools generally may have been created, but it doesn't help me whatsoever in understand, because it's kind of cool, whether we're using reinforcement training or human in the loop or supervised training, whatever it is, who cares? As long as it gets the job done, that's all that matters. So from that perspective, you might look at it and say, well, the reason that I can't make that decision about the AI tool is because I don't understand the implication of the training method on its accuracy or reliability. If I knew that, and then I knew the training method of that tool, maybe that would help me. Or it could be that I don't understand the different ways AI tools are created in the first place. Maybe all of them are using the exact same type of training method. Maybe all of them use, deep learning, right? What's the actual point of difference between these tools? So you'd come to a specific list of questions where if you knew the answers to these, you may not be able to answer the question straight away, but you'd be in a much better position to be able to at least ask even more specific questions. And then that kind of becomes your learning curriculum. You're progressively using the questions that you think would fill in a relevant gap for you. Now, one of the cons of this method of going through things is that you are going to end up learning about things that after you've learned it, you will just realize this actually does not help me to solve the problem. Like, I've just learned something that feels irrelevant. You're not going to really be able to avoid that because you don't know what you don't know. So you will have to do some sort of redundant learning in order to be able to eventually figure out what you need to know to solve that problem. That's one approach, where you're starting with the problem, you're calibrating against your knowledge, and you're asking questions, and then you're filling in the answers to that. So the journey of learning in that case is that you'll start off with right now where you know very little, and then you've got the problem that you want to solve, and then you're saying, okay, what is the difference between where I am right now versus where I need to get to? And then from there, you're going to start thinking of slight questions. And then as you find the answers to these questions, it's going to eventually lead you closer and closer towards where you need to go. So that journey is going to be kind of like this. Some irrelevant learning, some redundant learning, but overall getting you closer and closer to being able to solve that problem, and some, meaningful knowledge gain and expertise along the way. So the next time you have a similar problem, you're not starting from scratch. Like you already have this existing knowledge. So now you're able to ask more specific questions straight off the bat, right? So that's going to be one advantage. I would be using this approach if you know that you're going to have lots of these types of problems in the future, and you need to be able to, first of all, provide a deliverable for your work in a short amount of time. Like, you need to go from not knowing something to be able to making this decision in a short period of time. And you know that you're going to have lots of similar types of problems moving forward into the future, where the learning that you've done along the way is going to be very transferable. I would not be using this approach if you know that you're going to be solving a very diverse range of problems that are less predictable, where the learning that you've done along the way, much of it may not overlap. Or you're in an early stage where you're really scoping through lots of different possibilities. And so you need a much more robust foundation of knowledge. Because if you learn in this way, it's going to be very narrow, right? Like if this circle represents the knowledge of everything that you can know about a field, and you're starting from the middle, trying to expand that knowledge, your expertise is going to look like this. You're not going to know a general scope of the land, right? It's going to be very, 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 broad versus like narrow in only a specific direction. But if the types of problems that you're going to have to solve require you to have a level of knowledge over here, and then over here, and then over here, and over here, then using this approach is going to be extremely time consuming, like going out narrowly every single time you have a problem, and you're going to feel a different type of overwhelm. So if that's a situation, I'll be using a different approach, which is you take the existing knowledge that you have, and instead of asking yourself questions in terms of where the gap is, you ask yourself questions in terms of what is the underlying expertise that I would need to have to be able to figure out the answer for myself. So you're not actually doing it based on, so let's say it's about the AI tool. What's the best AI tool to use? Okay. What expertise, if you had, would allow you to consume all this information and naturally feel like it makes sense to you? So what that could look like is you've got your existing set of knowledge right here, and you're saying, okay, if I knew about deep learning, right, like much more, then that means that when I think about all the different tools that involve deep learning, I'm going to have a better sense of how to think about all of these things. And so even though you're sort of partially being guided by the way that you're applying it, the key difference between doing it this way versus doing it the first way is that you are deliberately allowing yourself to learn more widely about this topic and build more, quote unquote, irrelevant expertise, because you're basically saying the reason I'm learning this is not just to solve this problem, it's to put me in the position where this problem and many other types of problems, I'll be in a better position to answer. The goal is developing expertise so that you can become the person that is able to solve the problem eventually, versus what is the fastest, most direct path of learning that allows me to solve an issue. So that's going to be overall long-term much more efficient if you are going to be making lots of complicated decisions about it. So if you are about to step up into a role where you're leading the AI development for a particular product, which I would hope that you're not in that position if you come from no technical background and you're just learning about this for the first time. But let's say that that's what the goal is, and you need to get to that point 6 months from now. So you've got 6 months where you need to go from zero to being able to make a broad range of unpredictable decisions relating to AI, where a gap in the knowledge may create a significant consequence to the quality of your decision. So very targeted learning is going to be ineffective. This is almost exactly the same issue that you can have with, for example, when you're studying for an exam and you're just using lots of practice questions. And the only time you ever fill a gap is when you get a question wrong. So you would require very, very high volume of testing to be able to figure out where that gap is. And then if it so happens that you're asked on something that's a different gap, then because you haven't tested yourself on that, you're not going to be able to do very well. So in this approach, you're more holistically building out your expertise, and you're only loosely guided by the understanding of the problem that you eventually need to solve. But you're relying a lot more on that innate skill of just being able to learn deeply. The most difficult part about using this approach is that because you don't have that clear problem to anchor onto, it can be hard to create a very meaningful structure in your learning. This is a common situation, especially if there's a very high volume of information to learn. So even if there is a very clear goal, like for example, people studying for a specific exam, you could be studying for a very specific exam, but the amount of stuff that you're going to be tested on could be so huge that it's almost like, well, I just need to learn absolutely everything. So that's a situation where even though technically there's a structure, the structure is just saying, okay, step 1, learn everything. So that structure becomes useless. So in those situations as well, the benefit of that is that because you will have to learn everything at some point anyway, you can be very liberal in your control over what to learn and what order. So let's say, for example, that you happen to feel more interested in deep learning. And so as a result, because you're more interested in it, you feel just naturally inclined to start exploring those connections and deepen your knowledge on that path. You can completely do that because you're going to have to learn this at some point anyway. And learning it when you feel like it's more interesting is going to be more effective than, forcing yourself to put it together. Or you might look at this map and think, you know what? The main thing that I see is that there's a disconnect between this bottom half and then this top half. How do these models of training or these types of goals, how do they interact with these core, machine learning principles? Like, what's the connection between them? That might be the part that you're most curious about or that you're most confused about. So again, you're going to have to learn that eventually. So you just start with the thing that you either feel the most comfortable with or that you feel the most interested in. And then you just continue learning about that until you get to the point where it's no longer the thing that interests you or that you're curious about. So if you start learning more about training methods, you might expand this out a lot. And at some point you feel like it's getting a little bit boring. It's getting very detailed and very technical, and it's getting harder and harder for me to follow along. So what does that mean? If it's getting harder and harder to follow along, what's happening in your brain is that you are starting to get overwhelmed. So going back to that drawing that I had before, it basically means that you have been building this knowledge. So you've been building these new connections, and as you've learned more, your network has grown and grown. And then you're getting now to a point out here where the same thing is happening. You're not really seeing how these things are related anymore. So you're going to feel the exact same thing that you felt before. You're feeling overwhelmed. And you're going to feel that this is a point where that knowledge is plateauing and it's starting to get slower and harder to consume this new information. So at this point, you don't have to just continue on to learn all of this stuff. Remember, you're going to have to come back to this later anyway. So instead, you might say, okay, well, now I'm actually interested in this aspect over here because there's all these questions that I have after learning about this stuff. So you might learn a completely irrelevant, completely different topic, and you start making connections there. And then as you expand out on this, naturally what will happen is that now this thing that was irrelevant for you before, okay, now it's actually relevant because you've got more connections to build that off. And so you're constantly just learning, being led by where you feel is the most relevant for you to build out that expertise. And then over time, it will holistically grow. But you don't have to be worried so much about whether you're hitting the right level of detail and depth for this particular thing right now, because eventually you'll be able to come back to it. So this is the best way of learning about something if you know that you've got a bit of time to learn about it, but the way that you need to apply it is robust. Like it's very rigorous. Like there's lots of different ways that you need to apply this knowledge. This would be kind of overkill if there's a very narrow set of problems you're going to be dealing with, relatively more predictable decisions and problems that you're going to have to solve, in which case you would just use that first method, which is that more narrow, question-focused way of learning things. But either way, in this case, where your questions are creating structure, or in this way, where your sense of relevance is creating structure, the fact that there isn't a structure given to you should never be a problem. And in fact, it's the opposite, is that for an experienced learner, structure can actually make things harder because it's forcing them to learn about things in a way that may not be suited to how they would prefer to go about learning it. So when there is structure, there's an additional technique, which is how do you deliberately break free from that structure to sometimes use these strategies, which can be cognitively more efficient. So the lack of structure is not a detriment. It's just like a fact. And it's just about how we navigate that fact that that changes the outcome.
Yeah.
So we talked about a lot of stuff. Do you have any questions about what we've covered so far?
Yeah, so I have a few things. First of all, it seems like the lack of structure may not just be a harm, but it may also be a benefit in not locking myself into a particular way of thinking and actually allow me to explore things based on what I'm interested in and what I'm curious about. So that was the first observation. The second thing was when it comes to the problem-based approach, which was more narrow, and the wider-based approach on relevance, which is much broader. Is there a place where I can use both of these approaches at the same time? So while I'm building that deeper expertise, that pie chart, and unlocking all the kind of sectors all at once, as I do that, if I identify specific problems that I need to solve now and kind of get that tangible value, is it possible to use that problem approach to solve that? And so I'm kind of building both at the same time, building that robust expertise. So I'm increasing my foundation while also addressing the small application areas that I need for the current being.
So the answer is yes and no. The no part is that there's always an opportunity cost. And so unless you're a hobby learner, usually you're sacrificing something. So let's say that you start with this approach. So then you're going to develop a relatively narrow set of expertise in this wedge. And so you might say, okay, so this actually becomes now a foundation of knowledge that you can use to build on other things. And you certainly can. So this can create networks out that create relevant anchor points to allow you to expand that wedge. So this same effect that we've talked about here, it's just that this initial set of expertise, this was problem oriented and that it's based around. So that you can totally do that. However, it's not going to be as efficient if this is what you're trying to get to at the end of the day, and this is the priority. It's going to be faster for you not to develop that narrow wedge. And that's because that I'll draw this again so it's easier to see. That's because each level of difficulty and complexity is not equally weighted. When you're learning very broadly and you're kind of being led by that sense of relevance, your own brain is telling you what is too detailed and too unconnectable for your current level. And so you naturally will end up learning in such a way where you sort of learn around here and then you realize this is getting too detailed. So you sort of start learning around here and then you build these connections and then you learn around here and you build this connection. And so your knowledge kind of ends up evolving naturally in this kind of concentric way where it's going from shallow and superficial to progressively more and more detailed and in-depth. If you think about the volume of everything that you need to learn, this stuff that's here, which forms that kind of core big picture understanding, makes up maybe 10 to 20% of everything that you need to know. But that 10 to 20% shapes the remaining 80% of everything. So if you've got errors in the way that you've understood this, those errors are going to be passed through in misunderstanding this 80% or slowing down your ability to make those connections because, right, if these connections are wrong, you're not going to be able to find the right ways that it fits. And actually, this is a common thing that happens if you don't develop expertise very accurately, is that you will feel like you know a lot about the topic. But when you start going through very specific details, you're like, I don't understand how this makes sense anymore. This detail doesn't make sense to me. And the reason it doesn't make sense to you is that it doesn't align with your schema of how you've understood this topic. And that's because you've understood the topic wrong. And so now that detail is challenging your entire understanding about how you've thought about everything. And now you have to relearn that schema. And that's actually very challenging and very time consuming. So if you've learned it incorrectly, and then you have to go through and then relearn and redevelop that entire schema, it's much, much more difficult to do that than to have just learned it correctly in the first place, right? That's disproportionately time consuming. So when you start with relevance, you end up naturally going in a pretty good order. You tackle the most important stuff first, which puts you in a great position to then go through the 80% remaining detail. And it's likely that it's going to be more accurate, it's going to be more relevant, it's going to fit into place more easily. And then as that again grows, you're going to get that snowballing where the more and more you learn, the faster and easier it is to learn it because you've got so many connection points. It's very rare for a piece of knowledge to appear anywhere where you can't immediately see how it's all connected, right? And that's kind of the holy grail of learning, is that you want to get to that snowball effect as quickly as possible because that's where that efficiency is going to come from. You're not going to be able to get to that very quickly if you're developing that narrow wedge, because if something appears out here, there may not be a relevant connection anywhere around there. And again, this piece of knowledge, in order to see how it connects through, it may require you to rearrange the way that you've understood this. So while you can use a problem as an anchor point to create efficiency in the short term and then eventually expand out, you should do that knowing that your ability to develop holistic expertise will be slower than if you had just tried to develop holistic expertise starting from the beginning. And again, if you're just like a hobby learner, if you've got lots of time available to you, that could be fine. Like, let's say that this is your prerogative for work, so you need to be able to do that. But over the next 2 years, you want to be able to continue to develop that. Then by all means, like for sure, you definitely can do that. And that could be a very natural way of getting a work output while also developing your expertise. But if you're in a situation where it's like, you need to be able to do this, have really good expertise for high stakes decisions, and that deadline is coming imminent to you, you need to be able to do that very quickly, and you need to be able to solve problems at work, then, I would say it's better to try to just make a decision about which thing is going to be faster, because you're going to have an opportunity cost. If you start here, you're going to delay your ability to make that decision, whereas if you start here, you're going to delay your ability to develop that holistic expertise. And that's going to be a separate kind of decision that you would have to make.
Yeah, that's super interesting and very helpful as well. For me, there isn't a particular time frame to it. It's just, I guess, I want to learn it as soon as possible, which I guess if that's my goal, then going in layers and going that concentric circle is going to be the most effective approach.
Yeah.
So
this approach is definitely going to be faster and more effective for you. And the flip side is that it is much safer and more efficient to start with this, and then when a problem arises, you can expand out from that. Because the difference is that instead of developing this narrow wedge, what you're going to end up developing is like a pretty robust foundation, and then extending out into a specific problem is much easier than starting really narrow and then trying to build that out holistically. This is much more time consuming doing it this way, much less efficient and much more error prone. So if that's the situation and there isn't a clear deadline, then using the more relevance led approach is going to be much better. Having said that, honestly, with both of these approaches, but especially with this, your actual skill in being able to seek out what is relevant and your own skill in being self-aware at understanding, is this feeling overwhelming? Is this feeling relevant to me? And actually calibrating that has to be tuned in. This completely depends on your own ability to learn something and understand, okay, this is feeling overwhelming. I'm starting to enter into this pattern of having to memorize it or rote learn it because it doesn't click anywhere. For a lot of learners, they feel that is normal. It's not clicking. I don't really get it. I don't see how it fits into the big picture, or it's too overwhelming to think about how it fits into the big picture. These signs are very normal for a lot of learners to feel, and so they won't really think much about that. There's no consequence to it. They'll think, okay, well, this is just what learning is about. I'm just going to keep going through and covering the content. But actually, the correct judgment to have made is, this is feeling really overwhelming. I don't see how it fits into the big picture. It's going to take me too long. Either pause, consolidate, get to the point where it fits into the big picture so it does make sense to you, and now it's not overwhelming. Or if you can't do that, scale back. Make it simpler or pivot. What is the thing that you feel, you can understand that's simpler? And just keep looking for those easy wins of where like basically the lowest hanging fruit. But the difference is that when you pick the fruit, it's not just you've picked the lower hanging fruit and eventually there are going to be fruits that are so high and out of reach. It's like every time you pick the fruit, you also like grow. You're
Yes.
like that, like, was it like Lamarckian evolution, like the giraffe that as it tries to pick the higher and higher fruits, it's like neck gets longer and longer. That's actually what's going to happen. Is like you start with the lowest one, and then with each one you eat, your ability to reach actually starts growing. So the stuff that at the beginning was so out of reach, at some point that will become your next lowest hanging fruit. And so that's a skill that has to be really wired in, which goes against the habit of a lot of learners.
Right, I see. And I assume that even with your analogy of the giraffe that keeps growing its neck, at the start, like for me, it's kind of hard to get a big picture understanding, especially when I don't have any technical background, because there's just so many fruits I have to kind of look for the right one. But is it the case where if I just start picking these low-hanging fruits that as my neck grows longer, eventually there'll be a stage where picking more apples or fruits becomes easier and easier, and it compounds over time.
Yeah, that's exactly, and that's snowballing. So when there's so many things that you can start from, it doesn't matter. Just start from the one that you feel the most comfortable and confident to be able to handle. The one that you feel you can integrate into your network the easiest. So for example, like if I just like share personally, when I'm going through learning about AI and ML, because I come from a medical background and a research background, and as part of research, I had to learn a lot about statistics. The statistics aspect of the math was the part that for me, I felt I could connect with most easily. So the stuff that was actually fairly technically detailed, for me, it felt comfortable because I was used to thinking about those concepts. But a very similar other aspect within maths, which is maybe even more basic than that, technically more basic, I wasn't able to connect with as much because my mathematics foundation is not as high in that area. So again, it doesn't really matter about, there's no right order. There is only the right order for you. And the way that you learn it versus how someone else learns it, or someone else tells you that this is the way that you should learn it. I would always be skeptical, and just try to be really, really self-aware in terms of where you feel that your knowledge gaps are.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of the concepts that you shared today, they definitely gave me a lot of light bulb moments on how I can change my learning to learn AI more effectively. I guess to kind of just sum up and make sure I'm on the same page in terms of the specifics, is it possible for you to give me like a list of strategies that you recommend based on like everything we've discussed so far to help me engage in this way of layering and learning?
Just before I answer Julian's question and go into the specific learning techniques, I want to make it clear, this is not a comprehensive list. This is not everything. There are other techniques that you can use. I talk about them in my other videos. If you want to see some more techniques that might be relevant to your specific learning situations, I also cover those in my free newsletter that I mentioned before. So I recommend checking that out. Okay, so let me do a quick recap because we talked about a lot of stuff. Up until now, we've covered that there are two overall learning approaches that you can use for this situation. The first one is that problem-based learning approach, that task-based learning. And the second is a more broader knowledge foundation approach where you're really trying to build that expertise more organically. I also talked about how we can build expertise through concentric layers of learning, and you can expand knowledge more gradually. And I also mentioned the importance of connecting new information to existing knowledge. And that's kind of the key to having solid memory and deep understanding. So those are the overall concepts that we've talked about. In the next section, I'm going to ask Julian to tell me exactly what his approach to learning is, and we're going to map it out and then audit his learning system. Once I've audited it, then I'll be able to provide some specific recommendations to him so that he can learn AI more effectively. So take it away, past Justin. Tell me about what your approach actually looks like in terms of trying to use AI, trying to tackle this high volume of information, how you're trying to convert that, and what the specific issues that you feel like you're running into are.
Yeah, so I'll give you a step-by-step workflow of how I'm currently learning about AI. So the first step that I do is I know it's important to get a big picture understanding about the topic I'm learning, which in this case is just AI in general. And so that's where I start off with. I try and get a big picture by just skimming through YouTube videos, asking ChatGPT to give me like the main concepts. So I kind of know where to kind of at least look at when it comes to like AI. And then the next step is to just kind of map out the main connections. I'm not super comfortable with like mapping out every single connection, but I roughly ask myself how each term is related to each other. How is this topic in AI related to this other topic? And I try and see how everything is connected into a basic map. And when I do this for the first time, I feel like it is definitely a bit hard because there's so many considerations that I'm thinking, especially when I don't have the background knowledge. So it feels like sometimes when I'm making these connections, although they're basic, it does give me a big picture. But I feel like it's still very far off from where I actually need to use like AI. So that's that. In terms of the result of that, I definitely feel like it gives me an understanding of the topic. But as I mentioned, I feel like I just need to go into much more detail to actually use the knowledge in some meaningful way in my job.
So let's talk about that meaningful lower level knowledge. So what you're doing is you're building this higher order big picture. So this part here is going to give you that overall frame. So this part's good. This is important to do because this is what's going to allow your brain to see how things are relevant. But the part that you're struggling with, which is the lower order, like the very technical specific details. So this is the flow that you've talked about so far. So as a general principle, whenever you're making a change in the way that you approach learning, you should always start with what you're doing and then just build from there. In very few instances would I recommend that you start from a blank slate and just try to build something that's optimum from the ground up. Even though that may seem like the cleaner way to do it, unless you're going to take like a 1 to 2 year gap where you don't have any other responsibilities or anything, and you can just immerse yourself in just complete habit restructuring from zero, that's going to be net negative. You will always want to just say, here's what I'm doing, and here's how I can make it 2 to 3% better, and just continue stacking that and just swap out parts as if you're just slowly upgrading a car. Okay. So this is the approach that you're already using. I'd say that the first part of how you're framing everything, establishing a big picture, skimming through YouTube videos, using ChatGPT, and then mapping out those major connections is good. Don't change that. The only thing that I change after that is the way that you're trying to connect that through just immediately applying that. Just delay that by a little bit. Delay it by like a couple of days, a few hours, and instead inject within there just one additional layer where you're actually deliberately seeking out the lowest hanging fruit, the lowest hanging point of relevance. And give yourself at least a few hours just to try to flesh out a little bit more of that detail, and figure out where those gaps lie. And then see if that changes the way that you apply the information or the types of problem, the way that you think about the problem. If you're comfortable with doing that, then all you need to do is just expand this amount of time out. So you might start with just spending a few hours spending time seeking points of relevance and learning through relevance. And if you're feeling, hey, this is actually a really engaging process, I feel like my expertise is developing, good. Pause for a moment, check yourself, try to apply what you've learned. Is it getting you in the right direction? Like calibrate yourself. You could be learning things and it feels great, but you're actually learning it completely wrong. So you need to be able to calibrate yourself every now and again. But you calibrate yourself and you're feeling like it's working well. Okay? Then expand this out. So instead of just spending a few hours, spend a few days. Continue to expand that. And then again, test yourself. Is this aligned with the problems I need to solve and the expertise I need to develop? And then if again it checks out, then you continue that cycle. And then eventually you can get to a point where even the way that you're framing the big picture and then mapping out those major connections is starting off with understanding where it's going to be most relevant for you. But just the only change that you need to make to start with is just by inserting one additional layer of seeking through relevance before going from getting a big picture understanding to then immediately applying it.
Okay, cool. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm assuming the more I seek and the longer that is, like the deeper expertise I will have and the more diverse problems I will be able to solve. And so that's kind of like the variable I can continue to adjust. Is that correct?
Yeah. And you will, if you're not doing it right, or if it's kind of not effective, you're going to be able to tell because you're going to see the exact same problem that you came to me with, which was the idea that when you do the application, you're feeling that there is a disconnect in the fact that, yes, technically you're able to build this thing, but you don't really understand it. You don't really, like, you're not able to solve bigger, more complex problems. You don't have that lower level detailed understanding to be able to use that knowledge effectively. So you're going to run into all of those problems. So as you continue to do this, these problems will naturally start getting solved. When you go to apply what you know, you're going to feel, oh, like I'm having different thoughts to how I used to have them. You're going to look at your old workflows and think, oh, this solution doesn't actually make sense. Now that I know a little bit more, I shouldn't have set it up in this way. No wonder I had all these other issues. I should have actually done it this way. So you should naturally feel that development and expertise is changing the way that you solve problems and make decisions. And if it's not, that becomes problematic. Either you still haven't gone deep enough, which could be the case, especially as a beginner, or the way that you're going about it and developing that expertise is too isolated. So even though you have the necessary knowledge, you haven't connected it well enough to be able to then apply it in the way that you need to. And then that would be a different problem that we'd solve.
Right. So with the seeking part, you mentioned that there was a cycle of seeking and calibrating yourself. And then with calibrating, there's kind of two main problems. So if I haven't gone to the level of detail that I needed, would I be able to tell that just because I can look at the mind map that I have and clearly see the problem that I need to solve? And there's a massive disconnect. For example, with the mind map that I've showed you before, I could like see that at the start that the terms and the branches I had was very far off from the detail that I needed to actually apply it. So that's problem like number one in terms of I'm not actually going to the depth that I needed. And so I can calibrate myself on that. If I haven't formed the big picture correctly, how do I know that that is the problem? Or is it just from a process of elimination that it's not the previous problem?
So it's not just process elimination. So in terms of the first part, yes, you can look at the mind map and say, this does not have enough detail for me to be able to, like, the condition here is that you need to have a certain level of nonlinear note-taking and mapping skill. That means that what you have put onto your mind map is a reasonably decent reflection of how it is organized and how you've understood it in your mind. If there's a big difference between how you have made sense of it mentally versus what you've expressed in your notes, then that's no longer a mind map, right? It's just like a set of notes. Like it's not a map of anyone's mind.
Yeah.
So if there is relatively good fidelity between those two things, then you can look at the map and say, okay, naturally, if I'm lacking all of this knowledge, I'm not going to be able to solve these problems. So if that condition is true, then yes, you can just look at the map and visually tell that there's a knowledge gap, and then therefore you have to go deeper. And then you would try to go deeper. So the way that you would tell if you've technically got the knowledge, but it hasn't been connected in such a way that you can use it, is that when you look at your notes and you look at what you've learned, when you look at your knowledge, the facts are there. Like you have everything that you need at the level of detail that you need to be able to solve this. But for some reason, when you go to apply and use that knowledge, you either cannot recall it or you cannot just connect it together in a coherent way. And that might take a few iterations. Like you might test yourself, run into an issue. You might ask ChatGPT, like, why am I having this issue? And then kind of, it tells you, well, the reason you're having this issue is because you've done it this way when actually you should have done it this way. And you might read that explanation and realize, I knew all of that. Like each individual thing it told me, I knew it, but it didn't see how it influences each other. And so that's a completely different issue, because that means that your ability to create meaningful connections needs work. And for most people, that's going to be their rate limiter. That's going to be the bottleneck.
Okay. Cool.
So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess my one of my final questions is, with the point you mentioned before about using ChatGPT in this process, which I was quite interested about, and I know it's a bit meta of using AI to learn about AI, but I am curious about your general approach of how you actually use AI tools to help you with learning any topic, not just what I'm learning right here. Because I've heard about like some research online about how like using AI will actually destroy your brain. So do you have any like guiding principles on how do I safely use AI to learn things effectively?
Yeah. So there's increasingly more stuff coming out about how using AI can be cognitively detrimental long term. So as a result, it's really important that you have a clear understanding about how to use AI. Like the overall approach and the attitude that you have towards AI needs to be very clearly calibrated. AI can be a great time save. There's a very general rule of thumb that you can try to use, but I'll need to add some nuance onto that, which is that you can use AI to save time, but not to save effort. So the nuance here is that if there's something that you're trying to do and you feel like I can easily do this, I just need to give myself time to do this. But you know you can do this, but you just can't be bothered. Like it's just would take so long to be able to do it. So a very, very simple example would be like extracting keywords, figuring out what the main things to start with are. I can very easily go through, open up a textbook, pick out all the headings and the bold words and create a list of keywords. But it's not hard to do. It just takes time, right? Or for example, even if I'm thinking about like lots of different ideas for something, okay, I want to be able to figure out 10 different ideas or examples of something. If I just sit down and think about it, it's not hard, and I have high level of confidence that I can think of a bunch of different examples or analogies. So I might use AI as a springboard. And even if it's not accurate, I have full confidence that I can look at it and tell that it's not accurate, and then I can modify it. It's going to save me time. But it's not going to save me effort. That would be a situation where I know I'm going to have to exert effort into thinking about this. I know I'm going to have to exert effort and trying to like piece things together and make sense of it. I'm going from a point where I don't know something, and I know that in order to know it, it's going to take me effort. That's a situation where the outcome is only happening because of the effort, right? The gain is only being wrought because of the pain. And so using AI is going to avoid the gain, because you're going to get to something that, like, for example, a common thing like the analogies one I gave. So for me, if I'm thinking about lots of different analogies and I want to have like 10 different analogies to pick from, I can do that, and I can look at those analogies, and I know that if it's not accurate, I can pick up on it and then I can modify it. And I've created hundreds, thousands of different analogies for this topic before. So it's not something that I am going to really struggle with. However, let's say I'm learning a topic for the first time. I'm not going to try to create an analogy using AI for that, because the act of me trying to create an analogy forces me to examine what I know and the accuracy of what I know. And it's going to reveal gaps to me, because I'm going to think it could be like this, but then I'm not sure. Like, is it this way? Do these two things truly connect in that kind of way? It exposes the weakness. And the process of having that weakness exposed and then filled is what generates that knowledge. And that's what translates into meaningful expertise that provides value. Now, if I use AI instead, because it's too hard for me to create an analogy and it's going to take me too long, then I'm going to have that analogy generated for me. I'm going to read it and I'm going to think, oh yeah, that seems to make sense. And not only will I not know that it's not accurate, the fact that it doesn't, like, that it makes sense doesn't mean that that knowledge is going to stay in my mind anyway, because my brain didn't do any of that neuronal work to create those connections. So those connections don't exist. So it's the understanding trap. That trap that just because you've understood what you have read or heard, that you will remember that. But if it was that easy, learning would be ridiculously easy. But to understand something is a very, very low bar. Then turning that into meaningful expertise that you can retain and then use is a completely different level. So in the learning process, it's lots of different micro decisions that you need to make and lots of different processes. Like, for example, getting the big picture, right? Like, do you get the big picture just by reading through the book and just trying to figure out what the main ideas are? Again, it's like, how much effort is that taking cognitively versus how much tedium is that? If it's a high level of tedium, but not a lot of effort, use AI. like a lecture transcript. For example, like going through and figuring out the main ideas of a YouTube video. I don't want to have to click through and listen every 4 seconds of a YouTube video. Like, it's going to take time. I don't want to have to listen to something at 3 times speed to be able to pick out the main ideas. Like, I'd rather get a transcript that's AI generated and then use AI to summarize what the main points are to be able to get that big picture. Because it's not going to be hard doing it the other way. It's just going to take time, right? Whereas the mapping of the main connections, this is the thing that forces me to evaluate the importance of each thing. And therefore, that's the thing that I don't want to have to bypass. Now, let's take that a step further. Let's say I've mapped everything out and I've looked at it, and now I'm trying to see, is there anything I've missed? Is there any major area or major segment that I'm missing here? So in order to do that, I would have to go into Google and like look through a bunch of different things, read through textbooks, looking for perspectives that I've missed. There's a little bit of cognitive effort in doing that, but it's not that high. But it's a lot of time to be able to do that. So in this situation, there is a little bit of cognitive effort being bypassed if I use AI, but the time save on it is so substantial that it's probably going to be worth it. So I might go to ChatGPT and say, hey, this is how I've understood this topic. Here's how I see everything like generally connecting together. Here's the things that I think are the most important. And this is basically the overall structure. Are there any major perspectives here that I've missed or that I should be, adding on to, make this robust? And then it will probably say, yes, you're missing this and this and this. So again, that's a time save. But then in terms of thinking, okay, what's the best way for it to connect to it? That's a decision that I want to make by myself. Even if ChatGPT tells me you have missed this concept and that fits in here and here, I almost don't want to hear that. Like, I want to make that decision myself. You have told me it fits here and here, but I want to challenge it. Maybe it fits here and here, like another place instead. Maybe the concept you've given me isn't actually the best concept. Maybe that just makes me think about an entire aspect of this topic that I've sort of neglected. And then now I'm going to use ChatGPT to generate some more information. So you might say, hey, you've mentioned this concept, but actually to me, it feels like it's actually an entire aspect of this topic that I've kind of been neglecting. What are some other keywords that would fit within that branch of this topic? And it will generate you a bunch of keywords. And then you can use that to add to your layers. So you see, it's more of that assistant to your thinking rather than the replacement to the thinking. So that's the overall rule of thumb. And for beginners, my first recommendation is to use it less than you would like to. It's easy for an expert to use AI and use it effectively. It's difficult for a beginner who's not familiar with learning, like a beginner at learning, the process of learning, I mean. Not a beginner at a topic. If you're a beginner at learning, it's really easy to fall into the trap of using AI, thinking it is helping you, but actually you don't have your own sense of calibration that's sharp enough to detect that you're cognitively bypassing something. And so that's really dangerous. And so you want to avoid that at all costs.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of like next steps, I'll definitely be following this big picture mapping and then really focusing on that seeking part and seeing how that leads to application. And then through this entire process, I guess just monitoring how much effort I'm spending at each stage to see if down the line there could be AI applications that may be relevant. But again, that's not the focus at this stage. It's more so actually developing the ability to like learn and seek and form these connections. And those will be the next steps.
Yeah. And again, just as the final thing is that if you are using AI in the wrong way, you will be able to tell eventually, because you're going to test yourself and you're going to realize you do not have that expertise. You do not have that recall. And I've got so many students that, like made these mind maps and whatever. And I look at it and I think, yeah, these connections kind of make sense, right? But then they say, I've got terrible retention. I can't remember like any of these things. I can't really seem to, like solve these problems. My actual performance hasn't really improved. And then when I go into the micro process, okay, how did you go about creating these connections? How did you go about grouping the ideas? How did you go about, thinking about this particular key term and comparing it with this other key term? Why did you draw an arrow between these two things? The answer is just like, well, basically I just went to ChatGPT and I just said, how do I need to arrange this topic? What are the main ideas? How do I need to connect them together? Why is this thing important? And all they did is they just completely offloaded all of it. And they said, oh yeah, that makes sense. And they just drew it, right? And they just became like an extremely sophisticated photocopier, taking what the AI is telling them to do. Like, it's funny. They became the machine. They just simply followed the instructions that the ChatGPT was giving them, and all they do is draw it onto a mind map. So very, very, very minimal cognitive effort. So you're going to be able to tell if the way that you're using it is not cognitively beneficial for you, because the primary outcome you're aiming for, which is to have expertise that you can recall and then use, you will not have.
Right. So it's much less so about the specific technique itself. Sure, there's some techniques that are probably more helpful, but it's more so the thinking that I'm doing as I'm learning about this topic and finding that relevance rather than writing down a particular thing.
Yeah. And that's why you should always be testing that level of thinking to find those gaps.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it very much. I've learned a lot and I'm excited to apply this to my learning, and I'll keep you updated on how the results come.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool.
So that was the call with Julian. I hope you found it useful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Really interested to see how people are finding this coaching format of videos. If you are looking for a single masterclass on just all the things that you need to really start thinking about to become a better learner, then I'd recommend checking out this video here where I do exactly that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in this video.